For our story today, we turn our attention to generative AI, such as ChatGPT, such as Midjourney, and other apps that are out there of this ilk. These apps, of course, are increasingly powerful in using to generate images, generate text, but maybe not so much with using them in court yet, generating voice, generating video, and manipulating voice and manipulating video for deep fake purposes and other purposes. So the generative AI is coming and is coming right quick. But of course, how this generative AI generates is a bit of a controversy because some of these sites use public images that are in the public, but not necessarily in the public domain, not necessarily free of copyright. They're using people's materials perhaps without permission. So this might or might not be a legal problem. But the lawsuits, of course, are flying as a new class action has been filed on a privacy basis, as regulatory demands also are looming. Let's get started with this. The potential impact of AI on data privacy and intellectual property has, of course, been a hot topic for months, particularly in the legal community, that I circulate in, the IP community. My background, of course, is in patent law. This is more in the field of copyright, but of course, it's in the intellectual property domain. And so I've sort of been paying a lot of attention to this. And lawsuits have been filed recently, most recently, in California courts, among other places. In the class action lawsuit that was filed last week, lawyers have alleged OpenAI violated various state laws, including California, Illinois, and New York, as well as federal copyright and privacy laws of respective states when collecting data used to train the language model used in ChatGPT and other generative applications such as Midjourney and such as other sources that use it for the purposes of audio simulation, video simulation, or other purposes. According to the legal filings, OpenAI allegedly stole personal data from people by scraping the internet and various applications, including Snapchat, Spotify, Slack, and even a health platform, MyChart, which leads to potentially issues as it relates to privacy. So to the extent that this information has been exposed by the public already, that's one issue. To the extent it has not been exposed to the public and they are somehow getting access to private databases, then obviously that's another issue as well. And people aren't necessarily consenting to this. People aren't necessarily aware of this and what they're sharing necessarily and what they're sharing it with. You know, people didn't make posts on various websites or produce images with generative AI in mind, because generative AI has come around basically since late last year. A little bit earlier than that, if you're in the technical field, right? The generative AI stuff has been around in varying middling degrees for longer than that, but certainly not in a way that's susceptible to the public consciousness. It is now only where it has gone out of the lab, as it were, and really become a tool that's available to the everyman. And now suddenly people are saying, my stuff that I put out there is being used by these people without compensation to me, without permission to me, to train these models. And so perhaps they're infringing on my copyright. Perhaps they're infringing on my privacy. Perhaps they're infringing on my data rights. Perhaps they're infringing on my contractual obligations. All kinds of fun legal issues to be had. Rather than just focusing on data privacy, the lawsuit also alleges AI has violated copyright laws, which continues to be a legal gray area on a number of fronts. Yeah, there's a division of opinion on the IP lawyers to be sure. I'm generally of the opinion that it's probably legal under the relevant copyright laws. It seems like it's a fair use. It seems very transformative, using the transformative test. But of course, the Supreme Court very recently, in a Supreme Court opinion, somewhat chided us all collectively in the IP community about the importance or relative importance of the transformation test. The Supreme Court has recently ruled that we also have to look more at commerciality than we have in recent times. Commerciality had been the test, or the dominant fair use factor, going back more than 30 years ago. About 30 years ago, give or take, and obviously these lines aren't clear and bright, but this is just a rough guideline. About 30 years ago, we went from commerciality as the dominant fair use test, commercial or not, to transformative being the dominant test or not. It became so dominant that a lot of the IP community kind of ignored everything else. And the Supreme Court just recently chided us all that is wrong, and it has to be looked at a more holistic way. And I think at least they wrote that, at least in part, for this kind of purpose. They are looking to create a opening for themselves to be able to potentially render a decision down the line. So that's speculative on my part, but I think the Supreme Court is looking ahead and opened up this door to possibly give themselves a new line of attack when it comes to generative IP. So we'll see if that's what's going on, but it's very, very interesting for sure. Intellectual property protections are also the focus of separate lawsuits filed by different firms in a case claiming OpenAI misused the works of two US authors while training ChatGPT. Yeah, definitely not the first lawsuit, definitely not the last. Perhaps even more notably than this one, Getty Images has filed a massive copyright lawsuit for use of its images, which of course are subject to license and sale because that's what Getty Images does. And Midjourney has scraped those photos for use in its own generative AI. So Midjourney also in big trouble there, potentially, given the relevant change in the copyright law that we've seen even this term. Because this is moving at an exponential pace and is becoming more and more entangled with our way of life every passing day, it's important for courts to address these issues before we get too entangled and the point of no return. Yeah, that's a real issue here. I think there's a very decent chance that we hit the point of no return before the courts can really act on this. Because courts are, by their nature, supposed to be very slow and deliberate because we want to take our time, which is fine. But now the technology is moving so fast and so fast a pace that maybe the law itself can't really keep up with it. So I think there's a very decent chance that technology will get out of control before anyone, regulatory or otherwise, can act to stop it. We're still trying to learn lessons from social media and the negative externalities of that, and this is pouring rocket fuel on those problems. Yep, for sure. Social media, like the internet before, the internet itself, internet 1.0 was, a big change of reality. Social media, internet 2.0, and at least for me, I think this generative AI might very well be internet 3.0 because this is such a huge change. This is just like the Gutenberg press all over again. And now we have like these huge technological developments. The Gutenberg press was invented, and then it took like 400 years for the next Gutenberg press to be invented, which probably was the telegraph. And then you go from there, and then the telephone, and then the computer, and then the radio, and then the TV, and then the computer, and then social media, and then this. And you can just see the pace accelerating. All these new technologies, these new Gutenberg presses, all since the late 19th century. So basically in the last, what would you say, 150 years, give or take, we've seen these huge technological developments where the Gutenberg press took forever to invent. And then, we see these huge advances, one after another. And then instead of them taking centuries to do, they take decades to do. Instead of decades to do, they take years to do. The technological growth is growing at such a rate. It is a really interesting, notable concern. And ChatGPT and stuff like that, we've seen huge growth and huge changes in the limited time it's been around. So it's growing at a very, very fast pace. And the lawsuit filed by Clarkson does not directly name any plaintiffs, but includes initials for more than a dozen people. That's not going to fly. There's no way they can proceed anonymously. I don't see how they could, unless they're children. But they have initials. That's not going to fly. You can't proceed anonymously. So that's going to be a complaint. It's like, you've got to tell us their names. The firm is also actively looking for more plaintiffs to join the class action, as even set websites where people can share more info and how they've used various AI products, including ChatGPT, OpenAI's image creator DALL-E, and voice mimicker Volley, or AI products from other companies such as Google and Meta, not to mention other minor players in this increasingly developing field. OpenAI, whose technology is already being used in ad platforms like Microsoft's Bing Search and new chat ads for APIs relating for publishers, did not immediately respond to requests for comments. However, the privacy policies that the company doesn't sell or share personal info for cross-contextual advertising doesn't knowingly collect personal info for kids under 13. OpenAI has a separate policy for employees, applicants, contractors, and guests. In those terms, the company said it hasn't sold or shared your personal information for targeting advertising purposes in the preceding 12 months while also saying in another section, users have the right to opt out of cross-context behavioral advertising. That doesn't really speak to any of these issues because it seems for the most part that DALL-E and ChatGPT and Midjourney are using publicly available data. That doesn't necessarily mean it's in the public domain, but it's publicly available. So is Internet Explorer or Microsoft selling your data? Okay, maybe not, but that probably doesn't speak very much to what Midjourney is doing. Midjourney is just scraping huge portions of the internet. This actually was a huge reason for Reddit's recent change. Reddit was in the news, as I'm sure many of you know, for recent changes of its API access policy and charging very high fees for API access to Reddit. There were a number of third-party companies that made apps to browse Reddit, but of course they can't do that without API access. The apps are arguably better than what Reddit offers. But Reddit said, okay, we're going to charge a really, really high fee for API access, and it shut down a lot of these third-party companies. One of the reasons Reddit seems to be doing this is because Reddit is scraped a lot by these services for the user-generated content because it's how people write. It's how people write in the real world, right? It's a huge database of user-provided, user-generated content on how people write, on how people interact, on images they create, on videos they create, and so forth and so on. It's a lot of data to train off of. So one of the reasons Reddit started charging these fees was so that they could get money for use of their databases. Of course, now that money would go to the users, but they wanted the money for themselves because it's like, oh, we have this huge resource, we should start charging for it. So some of the basis, at least, for some of the controversy relating to that. In the lawsuit, lawyers also allege that OpenAI has violated privacy laws while collecting and sharing data for advertising, including targeting minors and vulnerable people with predatory advertising, algorithmic discrimination, and other unethical and harmful acts. The law firm says the firm represents a number of minor plaintiffs who are concerned that AI tech is being deployed without appropriate guardrails for children. She says that raises a different set of issues from concern relating to the invasion of privacy for adults. So maybe some of this content relates to children in some of this data, and that is a note of particular concern. It just really shines a spotlight on the dangers that can come with unregulated and untested technologies, Cohen said. Bringing in the claims against minors is very critical to why we think it's so important to get some safety guardrails in place around this technology, get some transparency into how the companies are taking our information, how it's being used, and get some compensation in place to make sure that people are consenting. The legal challenges come as the AI industry is also facing scrutiny from regulators in both the United States and other countries around the world. Last week, the United States Federal Trade Commission published a new blog post suggesting generative AI raises competition concerns relating to data, talent, computing resources, and other areas. The European Union, also moving fairly fast in this area, is moving forward with a proposal to regulate AI with what they call an AI Act, prompting executives from more than 150 companies to send an open letter to the European Commission, warning regulations could both be ineffective and harm competition. Lawmakers in the United States also are exploring the possibility of congressionally based regulation. So a lot of different people in a lot of different markets looking to try to solve this problem through regulation. You know, some of the regulations that they're looking at may not work, may not speak to the technology, and to the extent it can, may be more harmful than positive. So it'll be interesting to see how varying countries and varying legislatures look at this. The EU seems to be on the most aggressive path comparatively in the world right now on the AI generative stuff. But, you know, that could just lead to the AI being shipped out of European shores and shipped into other countries in the world as the regulations change. So we'll see how that all develops. Despite uncertainty and evolving legal and regulatory landscapes, most marketers are moving forward with seeing AI as more than a novelty trend and something that could be meaningfully impact many areas of business. Yeah, I don't really think it's a novelty trend. It's interesting when people say it's a novelty because when the internet first came out, people thought the internet was a novelty. It's interesting if you go back in time and you see some of the people as they were reporting on it in various news broadcasts or in various newspapers, this internet thing is just kind of a fad. Yeah, we saw how that worked out, right? Yeah, not so much. I think that this generative AI is not a fad. It's going to be a major changer of how things go forward. It may or may not look like it currently does, right? So I'm not necessarily saying that ChatGPT or Midjourney or any of the apps that we're using today, I'm not necessarily saying that any of those things are necessarily long for this world. Much like the predecessors on the internet, much like the Friendsters that preceded the Facebooks, that preceded other social media, right? Even if this stuff does not survive the test of time, it is a precursor for things that will be in our day-to-day lives, is my view. So I think that this is going to be a huge driver of us socially and in business for the foreseeable future in one form or another. At the Minneapolis-based agency, the Socialites, creative and strategy officer Greg Swan said he's been counseling teams that want to test generative AI tools to make sure they don't copy and paste generative content directly in the marketing materials. I tend to think of AI in this whole industry as a precocious teenager who thinks they need everything in the rules of the road, but they still need supervision. Fair enough. Yeah, I think it's come a long way, especially since it's now out in the wild and not just confined to the lab. But it is definitely something that cannot just be cut and paste willy-nilly, as we recently saw from ChatGPT lore. Still something that requires a human eye. But, you know, I don't think that will necessarily be true for very long. The way that this technology is developing and moving, how many years will it be before, it doesn't require as much supervision? 5 years? 10 years? I mean, it's basically tomorrow in terms of like world development time, right? I mean, compared to how we've dealt with technologies in the past, right? So it needs adult supervision, but for how long? Probably tomorrow, maybe the day after that. It won't be very long, I don't think. It's incredibly difficult to know where the line has been in inspiration and theft, fair. And just like all marketing outputs, source material matters, plagiarism matters, equitable consideration for creator matters, brand safety matters. Well, plagiarism isn't illegal. So, I mean, you know, there's that. I mean, copyright issues are one thing, and the copyright issues when it comes to some of this generative AI, the law was not built for this, I don't think, is the best conclusion that can be made. So maybe Congress will come along and pass some special law, because trying to cram what generative AI is doing into current copyright law is a pretty ugly fit, I think. Instead of scraping data without permission, some AI startups are taking an alternative approach by doing licensing. For example, Israel-based Bria only trains its AI tools with content it already has license to use. It's more pricey, but of course, less risky. And other companies are also looking at licensing as well. So there's been licensing issues from various companies and varying offers that people are using licensed stuff for some of their generative stuff to get around some of these problems. So whether or not this is copyright infringement may be somewhat of a moot issue in the grand scheme of how generative AI is coming to the front. The markets will respond faster than the legal system. I think that's very true in this case. I think that this technology is moving so fast and going through versions so fast in different competition at such a high rate. I don't really think that the legal system or regulatory system was built for this. By the time the FTC or Congress or even the EU does anything, probably too late. So I think it's definitely true the markets will respond faster than the legal industry in this domain. The law may not be equipped for this. And when they respond, it will force AI companies to act more responsibly. It's a well-known thing that models are no longer a moat. Data is the moat. Fun. Thus, that brings us to the end of this article, where we learn a little bit more about this new lawsuit as it relates to generative AI. In this case, OpenAI is being sued in a California federal court for violations of California, Illinois, and New York state privacy laws, as well as federal laws, as well as underlying state torts, such as conversion and underlying misuse and falsification and stuff like that. So this is not the first lawsuit. It's not the only lawsuit. It's not even the biggest lawsuit. Probably the biggest lawsuit right now is Getty Images, with the whole use of their images and their databases. Really interesting IP issues for sure. The recent Supreme Court decision that says that we need to look at factors beyond transformation somewhat changes the fair use analysis and makes my conclusion that this is fair use a lot more uncertain than it was in the past. And I think the Supreme Court wrote that specifically with this issue in mind. I think that they were raising this issue specifically to raise the issue and importance of commercialism because of some of this stuff when it comes to AI. But of course, that's just a speculation. And we'll have to see how the district courts look at this and balance the tests in all this. Should be fun and exciting. But for the moment, my friends, that brings to the end of the discussion of this story.